Hello, everybody. My name is Megan Baldy. I'm the Indigenous Food and Ag Initiatives Food Safety Specialist. We wanted to put on this webinar, and we're here with Dr. Valerisa Gaddy. Valerisa is going to give an introduction of herself and give you a little bit about her background. And she started to work alongside, I think, IFAI back in 2016. Was it, Valerisa?
Yeah.
All right, so I'll turn it over to Valerisa to give a little brief introduction and get into our webinar. We do have a few IFAI staff in the background. They'll be fielding any questions or comments in the chat. We are going to drop some links in there. So feel free to be very interactive and ask questions in the chat, and we will get to them. So we have Mary Bell and Tish. So they're in the our comms team, and they're going to be helping to work with us in this webinar. So we appreciate your guys' time. We appreciate you guys joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to Valerisa.
All right, thank you. So like Megan was just saying, my name is Valerisa Gaddy, and I am originally from the Navajo Nation. I come from the Four Corners region on the border of Arizona and New Mexico. So one of the things that people always ask about me is, why we should listen to you, essentially. So really what it comes to is that I was really motivated by water and looking forward to the future because of my son. I'm a mom, and so looking at water quality wasn't something that I really thought that I was going to be doing long term. I thought I was going to be more within the research, science, background. However, when after I became a mom and started doing a lot more field work, I realized that there was an overlap of what I want to do is actually working with grassroots and with people and analyzing the water quality issues that they may have with the with real world issues. Like that was mentioned before, in 2016, I did start with the IFAI, and I was and a lot of that work that I did was just giving a different perspectives. So in like I was saying, in when I started on this work, it was really interesting because there was just a handful of Native people that were discussing this new crazy rule called the Food Safety Modernization Act. Even though it was implemented in 2011, we were creepily at the time coming upon the deadlines and of the produce safety rule. And when we started looking in more into what the FSMA and what PSR actually stood for, there were a lot of questions relating to tribes and Indigenous people. At the time, I was working mostly with big scale farms out in Yuma and looking at the water quality there. And it wasn't until a lot more Indigenous farmers started reaching out specifically to me, asking, what does this mean? I know that you work with some farmers, some farmer told me that you work with them out in Yuma. How does this relate? So it's kind of funny how I didn't seek out to work with farmers. I actually, someone else sought me out because of the work that I was doing with large scale farmers. With the work that I did in Yuma, I worked on the 2018 Yuma lettuce outbreak. I have been a trainer pretty much since 2017, and I do a lot of water and policy and science communication. So I feel like I have a lot of in-depth experience, but again, I'm still open and still learning a lot too. So next slide, please. Like I said before, the produce safety rule was really something that threw a wrench in a lot of farmers' plans, especially the small scale farmers. While I did work with large farmers in Yuma, especially during my PhD, I also really started working with some of the smaller scale farmers, dealing with how we could be able to translate this huge, policy, the Food Safety Modernization Act, and within that, the produce safety rule, and how it affects them. Next slide, please. And if you read the whole rule, it really does focus more on prevention rather than reaction, because our food safety model in the United States has been always one of reaction instead. And so with this new emphasis on prevention, one thing that was blatantly clear was that there is no mention of tribal nations, and how does this rule affect them? Next slide, please. So, like I was saying earlier, with not knowing exactly how it was going to affect them, as an afterthought, the government, the FDA, really did just say, okay, well, all tribal nations are exempt. Well, in theory, that does sound good, and it did sound like, oh, maybe one time maybe for once the government could be on our side. However, that doesn't mean that you're exempt from the market. And because you're not exempt from the market means that you're also not, that you're losing a lot of revenue and a lot of other sources and resources, especially when it comes to even some of the grant funding that you may be applying to. And so why I was really, really focused, especially where I'm from here in Arizona, is that Arizona has one of the largest number of native growers and ranchers. Almost half of all our farmers and ranchers are here in Arizona, identify as Native American. About 1/3 of our land mass in Arizona is tended by is tribal lands. So that's huge land, considering that Arizona is one of the bigger states. On average, the farms here in Arizona are around 200% larger, meaning that our tribal farms are also a lot larger. And in 2015, this also needs to be updated, but in 2015, they sold close to $85 million worth of agriculture products. And more recently, I believe in the 2019, that was almost 200 million. So the Arizona ag, especially with relating to Native farmers, it does hold a significant weight in the economy of for the state of Arizona. So next slide. So when I was working with the tribal workers here in Arizona, I was working mainly with the 22 federally recognized tribes here, and relating and especially the ones that had farms. So there are a few tribes that didn't have any farms or didn't have any tribal owned farms or anything like that. But since coming from the Navajo Nation, and I worked a lot with the Navajo Nation, I did a lot of my work with working on with the smaller farmers that are that are native, that are Navajo, I meant. When we were doing our discussions, and when I was doing my trainings and helping them try to figure out if the produce safety rule was right for them, and how, how this new rule was going to play into their future of their farm. One of the main concerns that I always heard was that they were really concerned about irrigation rights. Right now, Arizona has always been a state that's been very divided on water rights, and many of the tribes are still in litigation, and it's just always been a really a hard state to live in if you are used to abundance of water. So that's always been the concern, and the hot topic for a lot of these tribal farmers was how will PSR, or the produce safety rule, affect our irrigation rates, and will we have that going forward in the future? So next slide, please. So when we were discussing a lot of this produce safety rule, this was back in 2016, 2017, 2018, during that time period. They had their proposed produce safety rule was actually very it wasn't good. I'll just tell it straight. It was really bad. The new rule, especially for pre-harvest water, um, is still not solidified, and hopefully it should be done. We'll see. It's still in contention, and because a lot of that contention is because scientists like myself and other people raised a lot of questions when you're doing an agricultural water assessment. At the time, they tried to keep in mind these specific requirements for testing your water. And it just kind of became a nightmare of having to test water within a certain time frame, within a certain capacity at a state or federally recognized laboratory. So it wasn't something that was feasible for everyone, especially a lot of these smaller farms, and in particular, a lot of tribal farms. When I was working with the Navajo Nation, a lot of the farmers were, many hours away from even a federal or state-run laboratory that would be able to process these samples. And you're supposed to have a sample collected and sent out within 4 hours, and up to 6 hours to get it into the testing, which is an incubation. And it's just not something was feasible for them. So they never really had their water tested in that capacity. And unfortunately, that was really the only testing method that was the cheapest and the easiest to use, and that was something that could be user friendly for everyone. So it did cause a lot of concerns, and about how testing pre-harvest water has been a really, really hot topic.
Yeah, so that's always a question that I get asked a lot of, is how do we prevent foodborne illness? And what are some of the ways that we can try and prevent foodborne illness? Well, one of the things I always get asked as well is, I thought food safety related to food handlers permits and relating to, things relating to food being cooked and washing your hands before you cook your food, and questions about that in that terms of food safety. And when I speak about food safety, I always want to make sure that people are understanding that food safety is actually from when you put the seed into the ground until you eat it, and essentially until you pass it. Because that is actually the whole area of food safety. We are very concerned about what is put in, what kind of soil, or even soil amendments that are put into happening when you put the seed in. What kind of water are you using, how you're watering that, how you're harvesting it, how it's being transported, how what's your food safety plan. There's a lot of different steps that go into food safety in general. So it's not just the food handler's permit that many people think about when they think about food safety. It's the whole span of that food, essentially that food's life. So the common areas that we do to prevent foodborne illness are looking at antibiotics and antivirals. We're looking at cleaning and detergents, hand washing. Hand washing is very, very big. We're looking at UV. We're looking at the type of food prep and the type of plans that you have in place, and we're looking at expiration dates, and that's the expiration dates on the cleaning products as well, and anything relating to the type of food and the process of the produce, especially when we talk about produce, is are there expiration date on the soil amendments? Are there expiration dates on the cleaning products? And so you have to want to look at every single one of those, because those expiration dates are also important, because they will help show, or they will help with how effective they are in treating and killing microbes. if you didn't see that last slide, it was about the best testing methods. Aren't you guys just having a great time on this, on this webinar? Yes. So when we discuss food safety, especially in terms of looking for specific pathogens, and it's just the bad pathogens that we're really worried about. And when I say that is, our microbes are not as scary as it sounds. Microbes are actually really, really good for us. They help us with our gut health. They help us even with our skin. They're essentially on every single part of our body. And having a good health, or having a good gut health, has been very indicative of having just great health in general, including having the very similar enzymes in your brain. So even having a healthy gut really translates to having a healthy brain. And so there's a lot of research saying that microbes are good and are very beneficial to our health. However, we're talking about those bad apples, those the bad microbes that can cause illness, especially in people that are immunocompromised, the very young or the very old, people that are pregnant, and anyone that has possibly like an underlying condition. These are the people that are really susceptible to obtaining a foodborne illness, and possibly could and the reason why it's such a concern is because many of these foodborne illnesses can really wreak havoc on your health, but not only that, have been known to kill many people. So when we are trying to look for these bad pathogens, the best way is to do it with testing. The first method of testing is usually testing for DNA. Again, that's very, very pricey. It's a very expensive testing method, and it takes a lot of time. Another way is through culturing. And when I say culturing, it means actually getting samples of your water and growing it on a medium in a laboratory. However, that's really dangerous. You're essentially growing more potentially like more salmonella or more E. coli or more of these bad microbes. And the last way is for testing is we're looking for an indicator organism. So next slide, please. So what is an indicator organism? This is an improved method by the FDA, and it's also has been known to be the easiest method. So what we are doing is you're collecting a sample. You're essentially putting that water sample into a dish, almost like an ice cube tray, and putting that ice cube tray then into an oven that only reaches 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And why 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit? It's because that's the temperature of humans. We want to see if these pathogens are able to grow. So that's kind of how the method works when you're using the co-alert method, which is an approved method and is by far one of the cheapest and easiest ways to detect pathogens. However, that's all we're doing, is that we're just seeing if there's the potential of pathogens. We're not actually detecting or we're not actually specifically counting pathogens. We're just trying to gauge if there is actually the presence of fecal matter, which the majority of pathogens are in fecal matter. So next slide, please. So what is an indicator organism? I talked briefly about this, but that's always one question that I get a lot of is, so when I suggest someone testing their water, I am suggesting that they get tested for the possibility of them having pathogenic bacteria in their water. I wish I could definitively say that yes, there's going to be pathogens in your water because we found them through X, Y, and Z method. However, there's no method that actually is that will do that without you having to drain the whole the whole irrigation canal or the whole water source and look through every single filter and check for every single filtration to see if there is the potential of having the salmonella or the bad pathogens in each one of those filters. It's just not possible, and it's just very, very expensive. So we do pretty much a snapshot. So we're getting and we're looking, we know that in feces, there's a lot of good bacteria, because that's what was in our gut. And then there are potentially to have some bad bacteria. And so what we want to see is we want to see, and what we're testing for is the presence of good bacteria that has been found in your gut that doesn't cause pathogen presence, but is also usually coincides and lives with the bad pathogens. So if you can kind of think about it, it's like having getting a whole snapshot and having this whole big community, and you want to narrow that focus down to one certain neighborhood within that community. So you try to find the one bad apple, and you're going down and you're just trying to get narrow and narrow. However, we can't get too narrow because it's really difficult and really expensive process. So we're just kind of looking for the type of demographics that we are trying to find that will relate and tell us that there is the possibility of having pathogens in the water. So next slide, please. So why do we care so much about E. coli? Well, there are over 700 types of E. coli, and there are only maybe a handful of them that are actually pathogenic to us. The rest of them are actually very beneficial to us. And so why we look for E. coli specifically, because it tells us that E. coli is an organism that lives essentially only in the gut of warm-blooded animals, and that it has been passed through the intestinal lining and has been released as poop. So really what we're really trying to see is there poop present in the water? So next slide, please. Yes, and so the different types of poop, especially when we're talking about indicator pathogens, or I'm sorry, indicator organisms, and we're looking for pathogens. The most common sources are cows, chickens, swine, like pigs, and humans. And these are the way that the fecal oral route, meaning that it goes into your mouth and you poop it out, oral, or even the opposite, fecal oral is when you ingest poop and then you get sick and then you pass it, and the cycle happens again to someone else. That is why we are so concerned about E. coli. Like I said before, there are over 700 species of E. coli. However, there's only about 6 that are really dangerous to humans. So next slide, please. This method, a lot of people don't understand this method of co-alert. So what we're looking at here is that we're looking for the indicator organism. This does not tell us what pathogens are present. This test just tells us that there is the presence of feces in that specific water. Next slide, please. So again, discussing a lot more on this E. coli and why it's important, and when we start talking about total coliforms and fecal coliforms and E. coli, and how are they all different, but yet how are they all the same? One thing I always discuss is that total coliforms are essentially, it's the big picture idea. It's the bacteria that we know that is found in the environment. So you want to see coliforms, especially total coliforms, in any environmental sample that you collect, because that means that there's the presence of animals, there's the presence of birds, there's many different types of, there's actually ecological value in that environment. So seeing that also shows that there are animals passing in and out of that area. So that's good. And that's always something that we want to see. Because it's when we don't see the presence of that we know that there's something wrong with that specific environment, whether that be a chemical spill and or what do you call it? Radiation from like uranium or something like when we see the absence of total coliforms, then we know that something is very wrong with that environment. So when we look at total coliforms, again, that's just the big picture. And then when we discuss fecal coliforms, this is where the fecal oral root, this is that we discussed. This is all the different types of poop from warm-blooded animals. And this is this is the fecal coliforms that we are looking for when we say like we're looking for coliforms in the cooler plate. And then E. coli is the species that we are looking for that pertains to the intestinal lining of either a human or even a cow or a pig or chicken or bird or something. And so you kind of get a picture of why E. coli is so important. And when we discuss these terms of like total coliforms, fecal coliforms, and then E. coli, we're getting more narrow. However, we can get even more specific once you go from E. coli to the family of E. coli, and then even to the subcategory of E. coli, and you just can get even smaller. But right now, we're staying within that big picture. And this is why E. coli is so important, because it helps us gives us a roadmap and can even show us where parts of our environment may be having problems, but not only that, where there's contamination, and especially when we want to pinpoint those sources of contamination. So next slide, please. So considerations for sampling. This is a question that I also get quite often is, when do I take my sample? Why do I take my sample, during this time? So when I'm working out on the farm, I usually have the farmer run through the process with me, but since this is a webinar, I thought that an image like this might be a little bit better for discussion, since I am not, I wish I was out on the farm with you guys, but I'm in my office. So just very briefly and quickly, the time of the day is very important when you're discussing and when you're wanting to do some testing, especially like right after a rainstorm. Your testing, your results are going to be off the charts. They're going to be really wonky because you just tested after a rainstorm. Now, if you're used to having a rainstorm every day at like 3 o'clock, which many of our northern states probably have more of a regular rainstorm, then maybe that is a time that you want to test. However, a lot of these southern states, especially in Arizona, we would never want to test after a rainstorm because we don't get those very often. So what we're going to get in our rainstorm is going to be a huge influx of the runoff from farms, the runoff from the roads, the runoff from possible other sources of contamination. So we really want to be careful about the time of the day. Again, finding a time that is right for you and right for your farm is always really important. So we always want to take that into consideration. Again, I personally wouldn't want to have these cows grazing in the background. Again, that is for possible contamination. Like I said before, the fecal oral route, cows poop, they could poop into that water. Then you put that water on your produce, and then you potentially eat it and could get sick. So when you're looking at testing your water, you really want to make sure that you're testing a location that is good, again, for your farm, and that could get a better image and picture. But you also want to, and if these cows were yours, you really want to limit and make sure that the cows are not drinking from that source of water, at least not upstream of your farm. The water, the water method here, they're not testing at the water source, they're testing right at in the field, which is not something that is ideal. You want to test usually before it goes out into the produce, so that's also another area of concern. And also, this person in the image is also what do you call it, testing without gloves on. And so again, wash your hands. We always want to wash our hands. It's so easy to pass microbes just with hand contact. And so I always tell people that it only takes a split second for a microbe to, you know, get onto a plant. Even if you brush against the produce, especially with some of the produce that are a little bit more have like more leafy, it really just takes a quick brush in for your clothes or for your hands to be able to contaminate that food source. I also have the water circled as well. It just seems like they are not exactly testing, like I said, the water source, they're testing it in the field when there's what kind of water is that? You need to know your type of water. Are you getting it from the ground? Are you getting it from the surface? So this, an example like this is something that I have come across a lot on farms and would then like to discuss with a lot of the farmers. Next slide, please. So again, like this, looking at some of the good side, the farmer has their gloves on, they have a good time of day, they're not testing right now in the fields, they're actually harvesting. However, one of the bad things is that she's wearing shorts. Like, who wears shorts in the field? So so the photo has, both of these photos have good and bad things. And I really want to say that while some farms may be doing good things, there's also room for improvement, and vice versa. Other farms may be doing the opposite and doing really well in some of the areas, but they also need some help in other areas. So I never want to put a farm on blast and never want to make them feel bad or anything like that. These are always just areas for improvement. And so I'm here just to help them make sure that they try to get the best water sample possible, and that that they can reduce the potential of getting a pathogen or a foodborne illness. So next slide, please. So the considerations. So a lot of these considerations, again, you really have to make sure the time of day, the season, the weather, and just because it works for one farm, for, you know, an 8 a.m. every day sampling water, testing the water might not work for you. If you're okay and feel like your risk, especially if you're using something like groundwater, and then testing it maybe once a month or even once every couple months, that is perfectly fine because groundwater is less risky. It's when you start you know your farm, and I always tell farmers that they know their farm and they know the best time of day and the best practices for them. However, if you are on a surface water, you have a large scale farm, and it is, you know, it's during a season where there are many birds coming, like for example, down here in Tucson, southern Arizona, a lot of birds are coming, going back north for spring and summer. So there's going to be a lot of birds flying over us. And so you got to also take into consideration some of the migration routes as well. Again, the contamination source, what is around you, really take a good look about what what kind of water you're using, but also what is around you, what is happening in near your farm. There's a lot of these foodborne illness outbreaks has been due to nothing with the farm themselves, but with everything happening around the farm. More recently, the 2018 Yuma outbreak that caused the romaine lettuce outbreak is that farm was doing everything perfectly, everything to the T. They were having great, even like levels, water quality levels that were perfect, almost well below the standard, yet they still had a major outbreak. And why did they have a major outbreak? Because there was birds that were migrating back north, and that's what they believe. The source came from bird feces. However, it was so microscopic and so little that even if they did see bird poop on their lettuce and they did do a buffer and decided not to produce those, somehow, some way, some feces was able to spread onto other areas of the field. Even though they did practice their food safety perfectly, it was still something that they still had the foodborne outbreak outcome. Maybe that's always something that we discuss. So just making sure that you know your what's happening, maybe even be a little bit more vigilant about knowing migration patterns too. So that was one thing that was debated about with the last outbreak. Lastly, PPE. And we talk a lot about PPE, especially in light of COVID. I always tell people that the best protective measure is washing their hands, because I know that a lot of people don't like to be told what to do. And so PPE can be always an issue, especially with discussing mask and discussing, additional equipment used for clothing like aprons. However, while those are very effective, the same does stand true that if they were to be contaminated, their PPE, then that kind of negates what a PPE is, and then they end up contaminating the vegetables or the produce. So again, the best method, washing your hands, but really making sure that you are using the appropriate PPE for the appropriate task at hand. And again, checking your water source. It really astounds me how many people don't know where their water comes from. It doesn't come from the tap. It actually comes from normally groundwater, but there are different other sources that the water can come from. It can come from like surface water. It can come from rainwater. Harvesting has been really big and really becoming really popular. However, what happens, when you collect that rainwater, it does sit there for a while. There's the possibility that birds could have pooped on your roof if you're collecting rainwater for your roof. So there's a lot of different areas. So really take into those considerations when you are planning on testing your water. So next slide, please. So really, I really wanted to make this more interactive, and I can talk on and on about all the possible considerations that are going on the farm. However, I really want to hear from you guys and hear how any questions that you may have, especially relating to where you could get your water quality tested or your water tested and why it's important, and any other questions that you may have, like any problems that you may have. Because while I can talk on and on about all the different methods and everything, I really want to hear how can you guys, is there anything that I can help you while I'm here, improve your water or your methods. So I can open it up for questions now. Again, I believe when I submitted this, I didn't put my information on there, but that was because I was in the middle of transitioning from from the University of Arizona to my new job, which is at the Watershed Management Group. So I can always update that and send you guys my updated information now. So it's been a bit of a crazy few 2-3 weeks as I've been transitioning from the University of Arizona to my new position. So thank you.
Yeah, feel free to come off mute and ask any questions to Valerisa about your water or your water concerns. Or you can drop it in the chat as well.
While people are coming up with their questions, I did want to just highlight that we do have the Native Food Safety website, which houses information on safety trainings that IFAI helps facilitate. So if you're interested in maybe attending one of those or having us come out, you can go and look on the website for more information. And then here's just how to stay in touch with IFAI. But I do think we had someone, oh, Tish put in the link to the Native Food Safety. So
Yeah, I know this is being recorded, so if anyone has any questions after the recording, definitely reach out to me via email. I'm very, you know, what's the word? Sorry, I'm very open and able to communicate really freely through email. So, yeah, so apologies and sorry for my bad connection. I have no idea what happened. I was on Zoom all morning, nothing went wrong. And then the second that I have to actually talk, something always goes wrong.
I don't know what it is about today because the slides too, they looked fine before we got started and then not everything was showing up. So it's just, one of those days, but appreciate everyone being super patient. And we will be sending like a follow-up email and I'll be sure and include Val's email address in there and her contact information so you all can have that handy.
Yeah, so feel free to ask any questions. Yeah, we got we got about 10 more minutes left in our webinar.
Yeah, and my apologies again. I really don't know what was wrong.
It happens. Happens to the best of us. So Val, when you were talking about how the Food Safety Modernization Act came out and how, we kind of felt like in Indian country we might be, our needs might be met. And we see that there are a lot of food safety disparities across the country. Do you have anything more to add on that and why it's valuable for us to, know more about these food safety hazards, know more about, especially the microbiology in water and in our water and how we're using it on a day-to-day basis, not only on our farm, but in our homes, around our children. Like you said, you have a son, and that's one of the reasons why you really wanted to get more into depth in food safety. Can you speak a little bit more on that in Indian country and how it affects us?
Right. I think one thing that people are always astounded to find out is that actually in Indian country, there's no effective way to measure foodborne illness in tribes. When some people, there's been, well, to my knowledge, there's only been one person that has tried to look at medical records and try to go through the IHS to go look at those records. However, the IHS does not report foodborne illness, especially if it's in a severe foodborne illness case. They usually send them out to other areas. Like, for example, on the Navajo Nation, if you're really sick, you usually get sent to Albuquerque or Phoenix or Denver, somewhere local where there's more facilities. But then within themselves, by the time that they take that patient, has has taken them and realized that they're in a more dire need and more severe, has transported them to a bigger facility. By the time they transport them, they're not considered a foodborne illness patient. They're actually considered that type of bacterial infection. So they're considered a completely different subcategory area of that type of infection, which they may succumb to. So it's really interesting how foodborne illness is not really in discussions in Indian country. However, some of the most foodborne outbreaks have been in tribal nations. And the worst foodborne illness ever, or a foodborne outbreak in the United States, actually happened on the Navajo Nation in the 70s, and over almost 2,500 people got sick. But no one talks about that, and especially in Indian country, and where food is such an integral part of many tribes or culture and their traditions, and even considered, medicine. And however, there is some safety aspect to it, and it's trying to, navigate that fine line of what is considered Western science with, the traditional values of being an Indigenous person, and making sure that you're being respectful of all the different tribes' relationship to food. So, but figuring out and showing a lot of these farmers, especially that in Indian country, the reporting of foodborne illness is severely underreported, and that they're more susceptible because of the types of food that they have. And they're also more susceptible because of the health disparities that are already present in Indian country, whether that be because of diabetes, obesity, the drinking, even domestic violence, stress plays a huge role in our on your health. So I think that that's one of the reasons why I feel like, people, it's really hard to navigate, because you don't want to tell people that they can't eat something, because that's not what we're wanting to do. Especially, we don't want to tell tribal nations that, well, I don't want to tell them that they can't, that their method might not be, considered clean or the best, because that's how they've done it for so long. But there's other factors that have played into Indian country's history that can really influence the food safety, the foodborne illness that is really present on Indian country, but no one really seems to be talking about it. So that's kind of what I try to relate, and how I try to, and answering that question, why food safety is so important. It's because it's severely underreported, and there's a huge need for more testing, whether that be water and everything, just because some areas don't even have running water, and some other tribes don't even have electricity. So I feel like that's the reason why it's important.
Yeah, I can totally relate, and I think that too, another thing that I always try to do when I'm teaching this is that, it's like, we don't want to tell people like you're totally doing something wrong, but I know that for us as, Indian people, when we'd seen something was working better or more effective, that we were able to introduce those practices within our, way of doing things, our way of life. And so I always like to say, like, this is good knowledge that you can learn, and you can implement that in your way of you're doing these things, the way that you're doing your food, because everybody in my community means something to me. And if somebody got sick out of any of the food that I gave them, or any of the food that I grow, I would be devastated to see that. And so making sure that, we can do our best way to prevent any of these illnesses, especially for our most vulnerable, which we know to be true is our elders and our children. And so, in most Native communities, those are very important people in our lives, and we want to make sure that they're safe.
Right. No, I agree. I 100% agree. So I don't think that people really think of food safety as a huge factor, especially when you have other health disparities really pushing that forefront. But like I said before, it just really only takes one pathogen, and
Yep.
we don't really have a good idea of how badly it has affected tribal nation, because we don't measure that type of metric. So
Yeah, I agree.
Mhm.
Well, if there is any questions, we got a couple more minutes. But again, like Val said, if you are remembering a question that you didn't want to ask on the chat, or you go forward and you're like, hey, I wish I would have asked that, feel free to reach out. Again, the Native Food Safety website is on there, as well as you can go to that website and get my email on there if you guys are interested in hosting any produce safety trainings within any of your tribal communities. Hit me up on that website. We'd love to come out. And then we're just thankful that you guys joined us for this webinar today.